Our next talk is adversary simulation, closing the gap in your security posture with my good old friend, Mr. Don Murdoch, who's also well known for his Blue Team Handbook. So with that, over to you, Don.
All right, Justin, thank you so much for that introduction.
Hey.
And you guys can see me very good. Excellent. Now I've got slide control. Great. Happy to be here with everyone. We're going to give you a discussion on adversary simulation and how it actually works and what you can do to use these techniques to improve your overall security posture. Introduction, who is Don? I've been in IT for 25 years, 2017 in InfoSec. I got my digital combat training in the wild, wild west of academic computing. And as Justin mentioned, you may have heard my name from the Blue Team Handbook. I'm also the security director for the NetWitness business unit. So the first thing we want to talk about in this topic of adversary simulation, and I'm going to hit you with a business term. And IT security conference, MBA stuff. Oh yeah, and let me tell you why. When you're looking at your organization, you really need to be business relevant. And one of the best things that you can do to be business relevant is to understand what your value chain is. So I gave you the classic definition from Mike Porter, been around since the mid 80s. The value chain is whatever your firm or organization is doing to transform goods and services into a valuable product in its market. If you're Amazon, it's all of the supply chain, it's the website for ordering. And now today, as you know, it's their own distribution fleet. That's all their value chain. So why do we care in our information security space? First and foremost, your value chain and how your organization interacts with its outside entities give you a catalog of exposure points. Where is an adversary going to likely try to penetrate? Where can you try to test? It gives you a roadmap to the valuable data in your organization. Think about Barnes & Noble or IBM. What's super valuable data for them? Credit cards, purchase history, author information, all those sorts of things. It really helps to ensure that you're being business relevant. It also tells you one very important thing, that when you're thinking about adversary simulation in your environment, it tells you what you cannot adversely affect, because you will cause a business disruption if you do. So let's actually hit that with where do you go to get that information? Your business continuity folks are very helpful in finding your value chain. Your security architecture protects your value chain. And it's not just the technology components or the technical components on the right-hand side, like your proxy, TLS break and inspects, your EDR tools, application firewalls. It's also your people and processes. Your change management process can be part of your value chain, and that's part of part of your security architecture, how you actually permit changes. If part of your adversary simulation effort is to implement an emergency change to control access to something, how would you actually inject that into your adversary support program? So, a little bit of ITSM knowledge goes a long way. We've got, historically, we would separate and be all separate worlds. As Justin mentioned in the intro, we're a little bit of purple teaming, right? Attackers think in graphs. They have to do this because when they gain some kind of a toehold, they start to pivot and go in your organization and they build maps. We as defenders, we tend to think in lists. What are the critical assets? What are the critical accounts? What are the critical services? What's on this network segment? So, you have to realize that we have two different mindsets. So the better off that we can integrate both of these mindsets in our adversary simulation program, the better off we are. You've also heard a lot about purple teaming, and it's kind of the best of both worlds. Purple teaming is that process where we cycle rapid change through. I went and got a definition from one of our colleagues, Jake Williams, an information security expert in the field, and to give you an idea of what these terms are and how to properly use them, because they're fundamentally different activities. In adversary simulation, we have the pen tester, the red teamer, and they're going to assess, meaning technically, your organization, and you really want to try to do that based on tools and techniques used by a specific adversary. The MITRE ATT&CK Group catalog is a phenomenal tool available for that. It's different than threat emulation. In purple teaming, That's kind of a symbiotic exercise. Red does something, blue sees if they can detect it. They go back and forth, they iterate. And as we like to say in the DFIR side of SANS and the security operations side, we like to say, think red, test blue, and as we build out our programs and our postures. There's an origin story I wanted to make sure that you're aware of. The term breach and attack simulation, or BAS, kind of started out in 2017. Gartner actually came up with this term, put it on the hype cycle. Today, when you look at where this term is, BAS tools are top of the peak of inflated expectations. So this technology set has moved forward on the hype cycle, which for us is a good thing to know. But realize, and I'll make this point later on, that although breach and attack simulation software is helpful and can test parts of your posture, it is not the same thing as a red team or a full adversary simulation plan. So that leads us to, if we're going to do this, we have to have a plan. And what have I done in my career to kind of make this real for us? I've actually coached teams through cyber range exercises for about 1.5 years when I worked for a major university. I've run these types of things at insurance companies, and a lot of the rest of this talk is things that I've learned along the way to help you understand how to do adversary simulation. So the very first thing you have to have is, failing to plan is planning to fail. Yeah, that's a PMBOK mantra. And it's a project management thing, but it's very true in our case. We have to think about the outcome that we want to achieve. If we want to achieve an outcome, to say, is it possible to exfiltrate our customer database? That's our outcome. With that, we can actually write a scenario objective. We can have an outline of how to get there. We can determine what the technical controls are. We can determine the steps to get there. And as we say here, if you outline 20 steps, maybe 25, whatever the number is, can you actually execute all of those? Can the blue team defend those? Can it detect? Can it respond? Can it contain? Does the blue team understand where to activate the incident response plan, the IRP? And a program is a little bit more than a project, right? A program is how you string multiple projects together in the aggregate. So think about this. If you have an adversary simulation plan and you've done an activity and you have a security operations team and you're unfortunately experiencing turnover on that team, say it's a 12-person team and every 3 months, a couple of people go away and a couple of new people come on board. If you have 2 of these things that you've defined that you ran in your environment, guess what you have? You have ready-made training and onboarding for those 2 new staff members. That's a total win for you, right? So you have to know the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the KSAs of your team and have a progression model. So where do you start? What's a good place? MITRE ATT&CK, obviously we've been talking about that for several years, but one of the benefits that the attack framework has is that they actually have put together an APT3 emulation plan. If you haven't heard this, there's different names for different groups based on patterns of activity. There's the APT in a number, there's, Green Dragon, Cozy Bear, things like that. Different organizations name teams differently. But what MITRE did to really help out when they were building ATT&CK is they put together a document that explains how this particular adversary group works. And then they actually put together a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet is really nice because it gives you the steps that this adversary normally performs in a sequenced order. It tells you how to do it at the Windows command line, and it tells you how to use Cobalt Strike as a tool to do ththose sorts of things. So it is a ready-made example for you to test all of your components. Like Kyle said a few minutes ago, you can actually use that and build some automations from that once you have that built out. It gives you a roadmap of what the attackers do. Really, really useful tool. You have to gain support for AdSim. This is time and money means something to your organization, right? We don't have unlimited budgets and we want to make sure that we have support. So, there's a couple of dollar signs there. With the best well-defined and well-designed adversary simulation, you are maximizing your security spend because you're finding out how well your technology stack detects the attacker. You find out gaps. It also makes sure that if you're being relevant to your value chain, you can bring the stakeholders that own those parts of the value chain together for them to understand your risk, the fact that you're trying to make sure that your procedural, technical, and operation controls are effective, and you can actually bring people together. Also, as a unifying event, I have to tell you, one of the most awesome things I've ever done in my career is to watch 3 different disparate teams with different skill levels working together in a cyber range to solve a case. It's really, really useful. Attack is a solid framework. Now, the other thing you have in here is I use that word audit. An auditor's job is to measure and report on risk. So when you're building out these activities and when you're doing the incident response and the analysis in real time, having a well-documented time and date stamped artifact can also provide you evidence that you may use with an auditor to provide evidence for the effectiveness of a technical control. And that, for you as a security person, is very relevant, because the more evidence of the effectiveness of a control that you have, the better off you are. So if you want to run a project, right, these are mini projects, understand your roles: red, white, blue, green, pink. Willing partners are extremely helpful in these things. One of the most fun activities I did was I found somebody in the organization that was a willing partner, and I had them generate a employee record for an intern, and we sent them a notebook computer and gave them a login, so that they could actually behave like an intern. And they were a willing partner. They had a written script so that when the security operations team found some evidence of shenanigans, that's a technical term, shenanigans, when they found their shenaniganing, they actually had a point of contact and they could look up and find out who the user account was and who their supervisor was. And my willing partner had some really interesting, crafty responses that kind of sent them on wild goose chases. Well, that's not testing how sophisticated your next generation firewall is. That's testing your people's ability to ask questions and engage with a person out there in the community that you have in your organization to get them to engage. You'll also see another business term, SWOT: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You can use that to help guide your project. Where are you strong? If you're really strong in some area, maybe you really want to flex the muscles of that system and push it. If you're really weak in some area, that might be something you want to stay away from or figure out how you can make that stronger. But looking at opportunities in your organization, threats you're likely to face, good and bad points, those things are all helpful to guide your project. Outcomes, you'll see that initial UC. How do you want to use the use cases that you developed and the findings that you had, whether you were successful or not? One of the nice things about using some of the automated tools, breach and attack simulation stuff, is they can really help you find weak spots and help you do some point testing. So if you want to measure your project and have success, I have 2 quotes for you here. And I love these quotes because they really help to focus on some things. What cannot be measured cannot be managed. And, there's a lot of good and bad in that. There's really good in the sense that if you're looking at time to achieve, if you actually collect the notes so you can actually measure the time to achieve something, then you can manage it. And the other thing that's just as important is not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted actually counts. So realize, as you're looking about how to measure your effectiveness, keep these 2 things in mind. I have a variety of metrics that I put together kind of as a reference for you. I put this list in the PowerPoint so that you would have these when you download it. We're going to focus on 3 specific ones. And my slide hasn't updated. Oh, here we are. So we want to be able to measure these things. The mean time to decision. And what I would say is mean time to decision is the observable event that triggered your security function. Whatever that function is, how long does it take the person who receives that event? It could be a SOC analyst monitoring alarm. It could be the security manager receiving an email notification. It could be HR saying, we need help in something. How long does it take that observable event to become an incident? And that's that definition. Did it take us an hour before we declared an incident? So you want to think about, how do you measure your organization before you activated your incident response function? Mean time to compromise and mean time to privilege escalation. These are not the same thing. Mean time to compromise is how long it took before the red team initiated the attack mechanism before they were actually capable of compromising a target. Compromising a target does not mean privilege escalation. Privilege escalation means how long does it take before they have full compromise where they have elevated access that they need. For instance, if they are trying to go after the DBA, and that could be Fred or Joe or Amy in the organization, how long does it take them to get the DBA's credentials because the DBA has access to the databases and that's what they need. So they needed to priv escalate so they could become that privileged entity. It could be membership in the domain admins group. It could be admin on a particular box. It could be the root user account on your email server, but you got to know the difference. Some prerequisites that you always have to have in some of these programs. We don't want to have a coffee break SIM. Got to have central logging. Now, if you're looking at this idea and you're trying to figure out where you want to get started and you have a herd of workstations out there and you don't have something to monitor those workstations like an EDR type tool, at an absolute minimum, Windows Sysmon coupled with Windows Event Collection and Windows Event Forwarding is a hugely beneficial tool. There's been a couple of presentations on this. John has done a talk on Sysmon. This is a frequently updated tool, and you could just set the event log to be 256 meg, go collect this data, and at least have evidence that you can investigate on the machine when something happens to go dig into the computer. It's really inexpensive to do, as in free. Microsoft provides it. There are some XML configuration tools to help you out. Network devices. Where do you have network intrusion detection? On your security architecture, can you actually deploy NIDs on your most protected network segment to see activity that went on there? Do you have network intrusion detection on the perimeter? Person power. It's really important to have people that are curious, that are willing to look at things, that aren't just willing to go off a list and a checklist. Natural curiosity is one of the most important skills and personality bents that you have. And attention to detail is pretty huge. If you ask John, you find him at a conference, ask him what one of his most effective blue teamers is, and it's a librarian. Because the staff member has amazing attention to detail, and that was what really made a difference. And I also find solid IT background is really helpful. When you think about your security operations function and your SOC function, what services are you going to test, and how long will it take to test those services in your adversary simulation activity? I'm going to focus in on forensics or e-discovery as an example to kind of dig this out for you a little bit. If in your adversary sim effort, you have launched something that looks so nefarious that you think you might collect a machine image, how long will that take? Where are you going to store it? And do all of the people who are involved have that ability? If it's on a remote network, do you know how long that's going to take? So this list of services can really help define what you're going to test and how you're going to flex the muscles of that service. You may be just starting out with a threat hunting program. So you've said, okay, we've got 2 or 3 people that can monitor the SIM and the analyst console. We've done some good tuning. We've got rid of a lot of false positive. Let's kick that up a little notch, put a little bit of BAM on it, if you will. And we want to execute a threat hunting program, and you formulated 10 hypotheses. Executing an adversary simulation program to test those hypotheses gives you a natural way to test the service that you're trying to do, a natural way to provide repeatability in your environment. Oops, I got to click. As your program, oops, wrong, I went forward too far. As your program matures, right? We have a single event, and a single event had an outcome, and then we've done it again. Now you're establishing a program, okay? Think about threat intelligence and understand adversary groups that are out there that may be affecting your industry. If you're in retail, if you're in energy, if you're in hospital systems, different adversary groups have been motivated to go after particular organizations. If you have a lot of international parts of your organization, realize that the cultural norms and the susceptibility to a phishing email will be different in different countries than it is here in your own country. So culture makes somewhat of a difference based on the people that you have. So your threat intelligence will help define a technique. and a technique will help define the tooling that you need. Tooling may drive you to implement some better infrastructure, and then you can have your emulation event, and it's what you're going to test. So, again, this is another example of a good slide to study for thought processes later on. Your tools should have, there's tons of tools out there. There's inexpensive tools. Previously today, we talked about Cobalt Strike and detecting some of the Cobalt Strike patterns earlier at the noon panel. Great tool, not very expensive. There's a variety of open source tools. These things are constantly being improved and maintained off of Git. There's a variety of build environments you can use to mock up a lab. I'm a fan of Detection Lab. Great little tool to build in a pre-scripted format, Active Directory, Splunk, some client machines. Recently the author added Caldera, OS Query, and you can have a little lab to test these things out. Takes an afternoon. If you're using the VMware version, you have to buy a plugin to make it work correctly, things like that. But again, it's inexpensive. And remember, traditionally, BAS tools aren't exactly in the adversary space. They are really focused at continued posture assessment. They can help, but they can't replace a person because they're not creative. I thought it would be useful to give you a chart. Pentest IT maintains this chart. They update it a couple of times a year. And this helps you give a good idea of what tools can be used for what area. It also gives you a tactic name on the left-hand side so you can figure out what muscles you want to flex in your program. Game day, you're getting ready, right? You have to make sure you have air cover. You want to make sure your red team is rehearsed in your pre-production environment. Willing partners really help. I mentioned that earlier. Make sure that your team is predisposed to creating results with timelines. Word has a great feature, Alt-TI, or I forget the keystroke. You can just immediately add a time event to something, which is much better than going and reconstructing that later on. That's actually some of the things that when I used to train and do adversary simulation at a university, I would have each one of my teams recreate things with a timeline. And in 30 or 40 events that I ran for multiple teams, rarely did I have two teams present the exact same method of displaying their timelines. And one of the absolutely most successful timelines I ever saw was the team put the defensive events on the whiteboard in blue and the offensive events on the whiteboard in red, and they literally drew the dots and made the connection. So as you're looking at their 5-foot wide whiteboard, they had everything that they found down to the second because they made really stellar notes. Now on the blue team, that first bullet is important to you. If you're going to do an event, are you going to announce it? Are you going to do it in an unannounced fashion? My thought and suggestion is that these should be unannounced because you want to make sure that you're exercising your normal processing and paying attention. Was the detection event spotted? Was there enough capacity for the detection event to become an alarm condition that someone could pay attention to? If you have 2 or 3 analysts and they're paying attention, they get overwhelmed. Do they have somebody else that can pay attention for an hour? Those sorts of things. You should be aware that if you choose to announce and let Blue know that you're testing them, you will be affected by the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is something you should go read about after action. It basically describes that when people think they're being observed, they will change their behavior. When you do after action, if you've listed your objectives, like we talked earlier about planning, you will have objective grading criteria. I used to do this a lot for everything that I ran. I had 10 things that they should have detected. And I gave people an information sheet. And I said, for this scenario, here are 10 things you should have detected, and have them write down or check it off or something like that. We'd get variable results. But the point is that let them know. And then they could compare notes with what they detected. Also interesting, if you're using this as a repeat exercise, or you're doing 2 team events, you'll see different things are detected by different people at different times based on personality events and skill trees. Request everybody to write their observations in writing, toss them up on the screen, and have an open discussion because that promotes what they said responses. You need to be careful of that. Looks like a tree, and obviously you're building up your IR skills over time. Incident response is a team sport. I'm a big fan of 2 people working together. The teams that I had that were most effective on the range or in real life had multiple people working together for something, not just a single person. Somebody's making notes to track things down, sending off an email to get further information while the other person is investigating. There's different ways of doing reports and different ways of structuring this. Pick your own standard, what you're using. If you don't have one and you want one, you could use the PICERL model. That's preparation. What did you do to prepare your environment? Identification. Where did you find that? Containment. What did you do to contain the event? Eradication. What did you do to remove the event or the adverse event? Recovery. How do you know you're going to get back to business? And lessons learned. After action. I'm a big fan of DevOps with the CALMS acronym, Culture, Automation, Lean, Measurement, Sharing. That's what that stands for. You know, the organizations that share actually do better in the long run, and make sure that people are asked to contribute. I went and got an article out of Pentest magazine, and the short of this, if you went and looked this up, is the article explains that in this particular event, the red team was stopping their event because blue found something that looked like it was nefarious. What blue had the presence of mind to bring in the red team member when they had this event and look at the event. The red team member has a different skill base. He looked at what the blue team had detected, and he basically said, look, this is a live attacker in our environment. I believe their next step would be this particular action. They performed a scan, they did a particular check. He found out that yes, there was a vulnerability there. Once they validated that, blue put in an emergency change control, implemented a fix, and within 1 hour, the active real adversary was in the environment and attempting to do the exact same thing that the organization's red teamer had done and protected the org. And I got to tell you, this is a win. This story is worth reading about, of how you can integrate an internal red team function in your organization for your adversary simulation of blue team defense responses. It's really quite a telling event. I have to go. I went and said too far a little bit. Let's go back to our 30, 60, 90-day slides. We like to give you something actionable, right? So within the next month, if you're up to the challenge, determine who your value chain is. Understand that's what your organization's presence, what they're doing. Perform a threat analysis, because that's going to help inform your simulation plan, right? When you know they are. 60 days, you have to have enough of an environment to stage a test. Don't go attack the real environment. Maybe you could do a physical to virtual or a virtual to virtual, build up a lab, figure out what tooling you're going to use, rehearse, those sorts of things, practice for repeatability, and establish how you're going to have air cover. Air cover is so important. When I ran AdSim in the real world, I would always go meet face-to-face with the head of information security and brief that person on the plan and let them know the approximate week so that I had air cover. And invariably, since they're more informed about company things than I am, because I was an individual contributor running these activities, I would find out good and bad of things happening in the environment that would affect my ability to run my simulation. It's actually very useful. Maybe every 3 months, if you're working on an aggressive timeline and you think you can do this, it's game day. Make sure you have your rehearsal, your blue team, determine what you're going to do to do responses, grade both teams, get your plan, your capabilities. And, again, you are moving the needle when you focus on measuring improvement in every single time you do this. Like Kyle mentioned a minute ago, right, in the previous presentation, you're going to find in these things that there's an opportunity for automation. And that's a win for you, because if you can do a little bit of automation, it's extremely helpful. Now, I'm glad to see that we got this far. I have an inexpensive tool. I wanted to show you some screenshots just to give you a little bit of a taste of what's out there, what you can do. BT3, it's Encrypto.io. The gentleman came out with this. He wrote a variety of tools that are Python based. And basically what this tool does is it lets you run activity on the network that looks like command and control. There's a couple of free examples. It's inexpensive to buy these things. Has an ability to replay packet capture, has some MD5 collisions, things like that to detect things, has agents. It's low risk. And what I like about this thing being low risk is you can go take the tool, see the Python code, see exactly what it's doing, see exactly what it's going to generate on the network, and you're in control of that before you even try one. Open source. This screenshot actually shows you, it looks kind of like Metasploit. So the metaphor to use it and interacting with it is pretty well known. You set this, you run it, things like that. The client needs to get the client. The client needs to get the client. The machine that you're going to run this on has to have the Python script. You just have to be able to run Python. So you do have that problem. Like a real adversary would be, how do I get my script there in the interpreter? Maybe you can turn that into an EXE, other things that you could do with it to get it on the machine. So the next question becomes, what does this look like on the network? Security Onion ran it on a tool, NIDS detection at an observation point. This particular item was detected on the network. So this is an example of how you can use an open source product, pretty well known in the industry. The Onion is a very well known tool. And by default, the rule set detected this kind of a thing. So this is actually a really great way to start. Security, this is like from a year ago. I don't know if Security Onion's updated this particular part of the user interface. It's been a while since I looked, but it didn't take me too long clicking around to come up with a few good examples for you of how you can look and see the affected machine and see some summary data and get some idea of what it looks like. So here, you don't have to go buy a really fancy SIM. You have a tool that's available that's, that can give you a pretty good view of what's going on the network and let you pivot to other data sources. Now in our lab, I ran this for a day because I built a simulation on this activity. The idea is I wanted people to be able to detect it, and I wanted to know, how's it going to stress my environment? So I let it run for a day, and I got 31,000 events. So how would you use this? You can take this and say, hey, if we got 31,000 events out of this open source tool, and we have this really expensive, cool, fancy thing, did we get 31,000 events? If I had two things that have a likelihood of detecting this event, did I get 62,000 events because I have two things that can detect it? So again, I made that point earlier about measuring and maximizing your security spend. And this is an example of that. So that's kind of my whirlwind tour on Adversary SIM. And as we finish up this session, just a couple of reminders. Have to plan. Use the Adversary SIM group data that MITRE's put together. Start with APT3 if you've never done this before. It has a guidebook, a spreadsheet. As we mentioned earlier, if you want to get a nice tool that's very helpful, that is actually in use by a real adversary, you could invest in Cobalt Strike, or you could use any one of those FOSS tools. I'm a big fan of ART, the Atomic Red Team tool. Make sure you know what you're measuring. Make sure that you have a 30, 60, 90-day plan. Air cover is really critical for this. Be business relevant by understanding that you're trying to protect your value chain. And I think those are the major highlights we have here, as I think I'm just about at time.
Awesome. So Don, quick question for you, because I can see some of this floating around, and I know you're always good for a good question. So folks are talking about adversary simulation, right? When should an organization start it? Some of the comments are stating you need to have like a solid IR process and the right data sources in and all these things in place. But do you agree with that? Do you think you should start some of it early? Because to me, I think some of it is adversary simulation doesn't have to be the full-blown 100% implementation. You could start small and grow as those processes are incorporated. But what's the Don say?
My thought is this: once you get a few key sources, and once you have the ability to consume those sources, which are your directory for user authentication, that pattern, an ability to get data off a workstation, and something at the perimeter, but like a really good firewall that can give you great data, you have enough to do some testing. Now, what we're really saying here is, how do you know when your security architecture has enough capability that you can test it? And after you put a couple of things and a couple of systems in place, start small. Don't think about trying to come up with this huge scenario where you're trying to, run all of these things. Start small. Think about the idea of saying, we have a lot of vendors that come in. What would happen and how would I detect a vendor scanning the network and possibly attacking the network. That's a very measurable target. It's real. You should have some detection capability and enough that you can start there. But there's no reason to go crazy with this and try to emulate, APT29, very sophisticated group. That's where I would start. And again, if you're thinking about it, you're evaluating what you have to see if you can do it. And you do want to be able to test and maximize your security spend. So that's kind of what I would do.
No, I like it. To me, I don't know why, but for some reason in the back of my mind, I'm thinking Christmas. I'm thinking like the little Christmas trees, but like when you're living in the apartment early on, you can't afford a house. Maybe you just need to get one of those pre-lit little like coffee table trees. And then as you get into the bigger house, then all of a sudden you can have the 20-foot tree.
Yeah, I really wanted folks to see BT3. I mean, it's an inexpensive tool. It's one guy's put it together. And think about this, right? How much does an AWS EC2 instance cost? It's inexpensive. And how hard would it be for you to put a Linux box on your network and see all the things that can talk to that EC2 instance and pretend to be havocs, just like what I showed you guys in the screenshots.
Yep.
That is an afternoon's worth of work. The only thing you have to do is on your AWS side, just make sure your security group is only receiving data from your perimeter. And then you have some protection. You can test your perimeter. You can test your net flow. God, you can test a whole lot of stuff with just that little startup. That's why I thought the BTT3's example is a great place to start.
Awesome. Well, the Don, I appreciate it as always, my friend. Thank you. Fantastic talk.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.